Future Fusion? One of, because I see the future and it's me winning.
What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. Now today I wanted to bring to you a card discussion on Future Fusion, because Future Fusion is one of the 6 cards that has gotten an errata in the Duelist Saga set that's going to be released on March 31st. Now the OCG has already had this errata for quite some time, but I also discussed the other cards that I felt had the most important erratas, like Imperial Order, as well as Necro Valley, and you can check those videos out respectively as well, because I feel those are going to have the biggest impact. But Future Fusion is a very interesting one that I wanted to discuss as well and not leave out. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Future Fusion has a new interesting card text that actually makes the card still somewhat playable in some instances. So to read off the effect, the newly errated text says, during your next standby phase after this card's activation, reveal one fusion monster in your extra deck, and if you do, send those fusion material monsters for that fusion monster from your deck to the graveyard. And then the second part is exactly the same, where during your second standby phase, you summon out the monster, and then if Future Fusion is destroyed, destroy the monster, vice versa. So why this is important is because the difference is between the old Future Fusion and the new is that old Future Fusion, upon activation, sent the fusion material monsters to the graveyard, and then 2 turns later gave you the monster, whereas now you have to wait an entire turn before you're able to send the monsters to the graveyard to fulfill that activation requirement, I guess, for Future Fusion. Now, this is a really big deal, because that means that Future Fusion on activation is a -1. But it has the potential to be just still absolutely, completely nuts, depending on the right circumstance. Now, I don't really have to go into the fact of how good of a card Future Fusion is, because any of you guys that were around for Chaos Dragon format should know that Future Fusion was basically an auto-win card if you happen to draw it in your opening hands. So it's kind of in the same light as when it was back in its prime in Chaos Dragon format, but now it's just a little bit slower, but I still think it's still technically an auto-win card in the right circumstance. So the reason I say this is because the most applicable deck that Future Fusion can apply to, and it's actually a meta deck that's already very powerful at the moment, is Infernoid, and the reason for that is because of Infernoid Tiara. Now, Tiara has a really powerful fusion summoning requirement because it requires 1 copy of Onunku, 1 copy of Deviati, and then the text says 1 or more Infernoid monsters. Now that means that because of the way it's worded, if you activate Future Fusion and it lasts until the next standby phase, you can send as many Infernoid monsters from your deck to the graveyard as you want to be able to just go off and completely just win the game. Because quite frankly, if you're going to be able to send 10, 12, however many fucking Infernoids you want to the graveyard, you should win that game, because that means you have Onunku set up, you have Deviati set up, you have a Tundle, you have Saitsamas, you have so many resources by sending those monsters to the graveyard, and then if they still don't deal with that Future Fusion till the second standby phase, then they're gonna have to deal with Tiara on top of that, and then they're just completely fucked already. Now, you could maybe play Future Fusion in some other decks as well. Some other competitive fusion archetypes, or, you know, something like with Shaddoll or something with Invoked. Invoked being probably the second most popular fusion archetype in the competitive scene at the moment. The problem is they don't really have much of a high impact for their monsters that are being fusion summoned out to the board, because when you use Future Fusion, and if it lasts until that first standby phase, you're going to be sending, what, maybe an Alistair and a Wind monster for maybe Raijin, or a Light monster for Makaba, and in the instance of Shaddoll, you're going to send a Shaddoll monster and maybe another Dark monster for Winda, or, you know, an Earth monster for Shekinaga, but you're only sending a couple cards and gaining just very marginal amounts of advantage. Where with Infernoid, you're just going fucking off. Like, this is just basically another copy of That Grass Looks Greener plus Void Imagination kind of meshed together if you really think about it. And on top of that too, the monsters that you would summon with archetypes like Invoked or Shaddoll are also not really high impact. Like, if you summon a Shekinaga or a Winda, that doesn't really do a whole lot. Same thing goes for a Macabre or a Raijin. I mean, they're okay, but compared to something like Tiara, it's just like, it's not even really comparable. So one thing I guess that's interesting about this as well, because I'm pretty much going to talk about Future Fusion for the context of Infernoids for the duration of this video, because I feel like that's where it mainly rests, and I feel that's where its primary purpose belongs. But I feel like one thing that's a little bit odd is that if you're running like a 60 card Infernoid deck, it does have a little bit of clashing with That Grass Looks Greener, because if you activate Future Fusion and then you activate That Grass Looks Greener, and if you mill your 2 copies of Onunku or Deviati or both, because if you're milling like 20 cards, that's actually a pretty significant chance of that happening, then most likely Future Fusion is just going to fizzle out, and then you're going to have that dead card there anyway. But if not, I mean, you're in really good shape. But that's just something to take note of if you plan on trying to tech out Future Fusion in your Infernoid deck. So I think one thing that definitely needs to be looked at in the context of Future Fusion is how likely is it, if you're playing in the meta for the most part, how likely is it that your opponent's going to have a way to out the Future Fusion, assuming you've resolved it without it being negated by something else. So let's assume you went first, you activated Future Fusion. What's the likelihood your opponent's gonna have a way to out it? Well, let's take a look at Paleozoic, because Paleozoic's arguably the best deck going into the new format now that we have the new ban list. Paleozoic has a couple copies of Paleozoic Olenoides, which is basically a mystical space typhoon, and Paleozoic Opabinia can search the Olenoides, which means that they can also just activate it from the hand as well. So it's like they have a lot of copies of Olenoides at their disposal as long as they can make a rank 2 play, and being able to draw 1 of 3 copies isn't usually too difficult, and then they can activate Olenoides on the draw phase before the standby phase where Future Fusion resolves the first part of the effect, and then you're pretty much shit out of luck. Moving on to the Infernoid Mirror Match, which is kind of interesting. Infernoids have 3 copies of Petrulia, and then they also have 3 copies of Decatron as well, which pretty much means they have 6 copies of Petrulia to be able to out your Future Fusion. So Infernoid has a lot of cards to deal with it as well. And then looking at Zodiac, because Zodiac is still going to be very prominent, whether you're looking at the pure build or the splashable engine and a myriad of other different decks. Any way they have to get to Rapier means they can get to Trident, and Trident almost means they have 4 turns to pop it, because since Trident is a quick effect, they can either pop it during your turn or their turn, depending on when they ever have a free material that they didn't need to pop something to be able to stop the rest of your plays. So looking at the meta overall, then you also have things like Twin Twister that are being played in the main and the sideboard, as well as Cosmic Cyclone as well. And that's pretty much just scraping the surface for most of the meta decks that you're going to expect to see moving forward. There's also a plethora of other ways as well to handle a card like Future Fusion, cards like Castel, and things like that that I'm not going to mention, because I'm really just primarily focusing on the really meat of the meta for the most part. So as you can see, there are some ways that it can be outed, but the interesting thing that Future Fusion creates in the meta is that it demands an answer as soon as it's played. Because even though it's a neg-1 on activation in terms of card advantage, your opponent has to deal with it in some form or another. Because quite frankly, as the Infernoid player playing Future Fusion, you don't give a fuck if Tiara gets summoned or not. As long as the first part resolves that allows you to send like 8, 10, however many Infernoids you want to the graveyard, that is all you give a fuck about, because that means you're going to get a free Onunku, free Deviati, whatever you need, you're going to have it at your disposal, and you're going to have those cards out of the deck. So that means that your opponent has to deviate some amount of their resources during their turn to being able to deal with that Future Fusion, because if they don't, things are going to start spiraling out of control, and Infernoid being the control deck that it is, they're just going to completely take over that game, and it's going to start snowballing out of your control entirely. Now, the thing is for the Infernoid player as well is that they actually have ways of protecting it and making it much more difficult for their opponent to even stop the Future Fusion in the first place. Take, for instance, a card like Void Feast. So if you open in Future Fusion and Void Feast, and assuming you have a card to activate and resolve Void Feast, that way, on your opponent's beginning of their turn, you activate the Void Feast, you summon your 2 Decatrons, one with Onuku and one with Deviati's effect, you know, already active. Your opponent then has to deal with a monster that can negate monster effects, a monster that can negate spell and trap effects, and then a Future Fusion that's sitting in the wake that if they don't deal with it on their opponent's next turn, they're gonna dump all the Infernoids they want into the graveyard and pretty much just run rampant over the entire match. So, Future Fusion is a really interesting card, and I think it's gonna have a very niche role in Infernoids. That's if people decide to tech it at all. So you might see it for the Infernoid matchup, but overall, you're probably not going to see it in any other deck because Infernoid's really the only deck where it's worth it. But who knows what the future holds? Maybe there's going to be some other fusion-based archetype that can break the card and give Future Fusion much more light in the meta. But guys, that's going to be it for today's video. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about the new errata for Future Fusion. Do you think it's still playable in anything else outside of Infernoid? Or do you think really no one's going to play it whatsoever? I just want to get you guys updated on what the card does and how you might expect to see it in the meta going forward. So thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and also be sure to back me on Patreon, because just by pledging $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.